Hello everybody, my name is JackCrimsonCAWS and I am the lead animator for ULTRAVIOLENCE Pro Wrestling. Today we're going to be taking a look at the animation process behind the game. Before we begin, I would like to point out a couple things. First, what you are about to see is not reflective in any way of the final product regarding this game, for a couple reasons. These animations are subject to change between now and the game's release. The models you are about to see are not necessarily the ones that will be featured in-game. The animation rig is versatile, so it can take virtually any sort of form, including this, even this, but definitely not this. Let's get started. So today we're going to be actually recreating one of the first animations I did when I was learning the iClone software for the animation process. So this move it's a crucifix knee strike, almost like a GTS. I originally saw it back in the second Acid Cup. KTB hit it in the first round against Cole Radrick. So if you want to check that out, you can find that match as of today on IWTV. So early on in the animation process, when I was just getting used to the software, I made a few moves that really have nothing to do with the game itself, but just a couple moves that would be complex enough to sort of get a hang of what I was doing. So that's what we're going to be doing today, is we're going to be taking a look at that animation, which here's the original clip, and then we're going to be recreating it using the knowledge I've gained and the actual assets for the game since creating this move. Again, this was the second move I've ever made using the software, so we'll compare them at the end. And then later on we'll also be cleaning up the Vertebreaker, which by now, if you've seen the clip of the Vertebreaker onto the barbed wire board, you've already seen the finished product for this, but we're going to be taking a look at the actual process used to clean up the animation. And in the meantime, we're going to be talking about a few of the techniques behind the creation of the animations. So let's get started. So first, a little bit about me. I've been animating inconsistently for about 10 years now. I started back in 2011, I believe during the summertime. Don't quote me on that, it's been 10 years, so I don't remember exactly when, but you get the idea. And back when I was getting interested in animation, one of the big things that kind of was a draw towards animation for me was, if any of you remember the old Endorphin Wrestling videos that were very popular on YouTube back then, those blew me away and got me interested in how they were crafted, how these things came about. So I took some time and started learning the process, and years later, here we are. So the first part of doing a move with animation is you'll want to get a basic sort of flesh out of the move. So very rarely, actually, will the move be done after the first pass. Usually I spend about half the time working on a move, creating the move, and the second half just fixing the little details that stick out to me that need to be corrected, which you'll see a lot of that here. Sometimes it's done afterwards, sometimes it's done in between sections of the move, but it's very important to get the basic move. So a few of the things we're going to be looking at later on though, how to define weight, we're going to be looking at how root motion works within iClone, and we're going to be talking a lot about clipping as well. Because clipping is one of those things that if you can avoid it, it'll make your animations look that much better. So with root motion, a lot of times with any sort of character rig, there will be the hierarchy of the character will have the main object, which controls everything. It controls the skinning of the character, it controls the animation rig, controls everything from that central point. What I'm looking at usually though is the next item down in the hierarchy, which is usually the root of the animation rig itself. A lot of times this will be the hip bone, sometimes it'll have its own dedicated bone. For iClone, it's going to be the hip bone, at least for what I'm doing. This is very important for root motion because you're not going to be moving the whole character as a unit. The way the character is rigged, when you move the character's rig itself, the character will follow suit. So that's how I go through and create my root motion, by using the hip bone to sort of guide the character. And then from there, the implementation gets set up for the game itself inside of Unreal Engine, and all that comes together eventually to create the effect that you're looking for. So weight is a very difficult thing to get a hang of at first when it comes to animation, because the way I like to look at it, I like to create the move to establish the base speed. Now, weight does not actually exist per se in animation. the way I best describe weight, because of course you can't like say, oh, this character weighs 200 pounds, so it's gonna be harder to lift them up. So instead, the way I control weight is using relative speed and distance. So when I'm creating a move, the first thing I'm going to want to do is flesh out the relative speed, or the baseline speed of an animation. Usually I go for about 15 frames per section, not second, but section. For example, as you'll see here, steps usually take about 15 frames to get that nice consistent speed, keep everything moving at a proper pace without feeling too slow, because the speed will make the gameplay experience completely different depending which route you take. So I prefer it to be a little bit faster. But once I've set up the 15 frame per section base speed here, and I'll show you a little diagram. The way to control weight is to manipulate how much the character moves across that baseline speed, as well as how fast it moves. So, if you have the same base speed of 15 frames per section, but the character's moving a longer distance across that 15 frame section, then you're going to get a faster animation, which is going to mess with the relative speed, which is going to make it feel lighter, less weight. On the contrary, if you move less distance in that speed, or in that frame section, you're going to have a more weightier animation, a heavier animation. And then the same thing sort of applies with moving speed itself. If you use the same distance as that 15 section frame, but you make it 20 frames instead, it's going to feel heavier. And then same thing if you speed it up. So it's all about kind of changing that baseline speed to create something that is a little bit different than what the rest of the animation is seeing, which you'll see a lot of that here. So a lot of times you'll want to exaggerate movements just to get that weightier feel. Okay, so now we've finished up the Crucifix GTS for this. So let's take a look at the initial move that was created months ago, and let's compare it to what we have now. And there you have it. So let's go take a look at the Vertebreaker now. Now we're going to take a couple questions that have been asked over Twitter and Discord about this process. So the first question is, why was the Vertebreaker chosen for the clip as well as for this video? Which, for those of you who haven't seen the clip, here it is. So the reason I chose, or the reason the Vertebreaker was chosen, I should say, is Gakda and I were talking about it, and number one, it's a cool and flashy move. It's always nice to be able to show something that has substance to it, that looks nice and performs nice. And the Vertebreaker is one of the perfect examples of that move, because it's a very intricate move, but it also looks great when executed properly. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, or one of the other things, is that the Vertebreaker provides a great exercise in controlling the amount of clipping within an animation. The Vertebreaker has a lot of small, close quarters movement between the characters. A lot of like grabbing of the wrists or locking of the arms. Stuff that could get really messy very quickly when animating. So to be able to create the Vertebreaker helps myself as the animator learn, okay, now I know that I can control clipping in areas where there's a lot of rotation within the character, a lot of distance change, and we're not going to have the characters morphing into one giant monster. So it's great for mentally controlling that variable, making sure the animation looks as clean as possible. And the last thing, which has to do with the actual in-game implementation, is it's great for aligning the characters. Because if you can align the characters to perform the move, which for those who don't know, alignment for wrestling moves and any sort of like multi-character animation, a lot of times the distance between the characters has to be defined in the game, because the characters could be performing the animation really from any distance. So you have to make sure that the right distance is being used, or the animation will look weird. If you've ever seen other games where they have multi-character animations, but one of the characters gets interrupted, so the character that didn't get interrupted is just kind of going through the animation with a ghost, pretty much, that's one of the things you want to avoid. Stuff like that. Characters that look off. So with the Vertebreaker, because it has so many close quarter movements, getting it aligned will make getting other moves aligned much easier down the line. And then with the Razer GTS, why I chose it is, I remember watching the second Acid Cup when it aired, and I saw this move and it just blew me away. It was just one of those things where I felt like, I want to make that move. I want to see what I can do with it. Because animation, while it does have good animations and bad animations, there's no right answer per se. There are different styles, but it's almost an artistic process in its own to be able to create this movement, because I can exercise my own sort of influence over it, which it goes back to something Kenny Omega said in an interview a while back when talking about video games and wrestling games. The benefit of hand animation over mocap is that you can control sort of the attitude of the animation. You can control the mannerisms better than having an actor perform the mannerisms to the best of their ability. You can control every little variable and create something that feels more authentic. So that's where the artistic side of things comes in. And then one of the other questions I received was about how long it takes to actually implement from start to finish a move. So to kind of put things into perspective, of course it's going to vary based on the move. From an animation standpoint, some moves are more complex than others, so they're going to require more time. And then from an in-game standpoint, some moves are designed to do certain things that other moves maybe wouldn't. So if we're going to use the Razer GTS from earlier as sort of the benchmark, according to the footage time, the crafting of this move and the editing took me about 2 hours altogether. So, some moves have taken up to like 4 hours, some of them will take a half hour. It really just depends on the move. But usually I find it takes about 2 hours between getting the move done and cleaning it up, sometimes a little more, sometimes not. So from there, once the move is done, I'll send it over to Gakdaw via carrier pigeon. From there, we were talking about this the other day, usually moves will take like 15 to 25 minutes to actually put into the engine itself. And the other part about this was with mocap animation, which mocap I haven't done a whole lot of work with. I think I've, at this point in time, only actually worked with one animation that has been based around mocap. But the one thing I'll say about mocap is that since the move's already created, you can skip the creation part and just clean it up. Fix any sort of hand movement, fix anything that might have bugged out during the animation itself. But the biggest challenge for me with creating an animation from mocap is based in reality, in that you have two actors or one actor, depending on what your animation is, maybe even more, but you have actors in suits that are performing these motions. So because you have these actors in suits, the animation software is taking data directly from what the actors are doing. It's looking at the distance, it's looking at positioning, it's looking at all these variables and creating something that, for all intents and purposes, looks real. It's based around the actual human body movement. So the biggest challenge I find with mocap is that, let's say we have part of a move that has been mocapped, but there's a section of the move or some way that it branches off to create something else that has to be done by hand. So let's use the Razer GTS as an example. So obviously this is all hand animated, but let's say we had the crucifix setup animated, but the actual knee strike itself was not done by mocap, so I would have to create by hand. The biggest challenge is making sure it sort of blends in with the rest of the animation, because you don't want an animation that's based in reality for the setup, only for the actual execution of the move to be choppy. So making it look like it flows, maintaining that kind of baseline speed and distance as we talked about in a way that looks and feels real, that's one of the biggest challenges I've found with animation. So a lot of times with the animation process, a move will get created just to have it, because maybe we'll need it or maybe we'll need it down the line. So a lot of times the move will get done, but then I'll have to go back and clean it up later on, just to get a fresh set of eyes on things. Because once you've been animating for a while, you start to see things the way that your brain wants to see it. You're not seeing exactly what's being presented to you. So when you take a break for a while and come back to the animation later on, you'll start to see these things that your brain didn't want you to see with a fresh set of eyes, because you're not looking at what you've been looking at for so long that things are just starting to morph together. Your brain hasn't had time to create images that aren't there. So that's what we're doing here, is we're going back to this move that was created a while ago and cleaning it up a little bit, fixing any sort of clipping issues, fixing the speed, the weight, all the stuff we talked about with the Razer GTS we're now fixing. And one of the important things with knowing what to fix is once a move is done to my liking, what I'll do is I'll watch it over 2 to 3, maybe even more times from each angle. So we'll watch it from the front angle, we'll watch from the right side, we'll watch it from behind to see what different details we notice from these different angles. Make sure nothing's clipping, watch it from 4 sides. Honestly, I would even consider watching it sometimes from the diagonal angles as well. Because one of the things that differs about video game animation compared to, say, like short films or regular animation, cutscenes, stuff like that, is when you have a fixed camera angle like you would for a cutscene or a short film, you can get away with hiding things behind what the camera's not going to see. But with a video game and gameplay-related animations, you have to be ready for the idea that the player is going to see your work from all angles. All 360 degrees, and then all sorts of different camera angles up and down as well. So you have to look at your animation from all these angles to make sure that you're not seeing something that the player is going to be able to see and will stand out like a sore thumb. So it's very important to make sure that you've got your animation to your liking from as many angles as possible. I mean, obviously you're not going to pull out a protractor. At least I hope you're not, and measuring from 1 degrees, check. 2 degrees, check. If you can get the relative animation angles down to make sure everything looks the way you like it, you'll probably be fine. And again, you can always come back to this at a later date and clean it up if you need anything. But what I'm looking at from these different angles, a lot of times I'll do it multiple times per angle because I'll start watching different things. Sometimes I'll watch the speed of the root movement, sometimes I'll just watch the whole thing to see what the visual presentation will look like. Other times I'm watching the arms, the legs. You have to break it up into different sections, that way you can focus on not missing any of those details. And then the other thing to fix minor issues is I also recommend frame by frame viewing your animations. So what you'll do is you'll go back to the start of the animation, or if you're focusing on a specific section, you'll go to the start of it, and then you'll kind of slowly just use the arrow keys to move across frames to see how it moves in between each frame. Another challenge with animating is often finding the proper reference material for whatever move you're making. So sometimes you'll only be able to find 1 or 2 clips of the move you want to make, and those clips won't always provide you with the angle of the move you need to see exactly what's going on. So some of the options regarding that kind of situation, the first is you can try and find a similar move to see how that footwork or arm motion works, but sometimes you just gotta try it out yourself. Now obviously with some things, you can't, or at least it's highly recommended against trying it yourself. So in those situations, you'll have to exercise a bit of creative freedom. And that's gonna do it. So here's the finished product of the editing of the Vertebreaker, and here's what it looks like compared to in the animation versus in the game. As you can see with a lot of it, what you see is what you get. And that's gonna be it. This has been the animation process for Ultraviolence Pro Wrestling.